What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of Lies of P, a Souls-like based on the fable of Pinocchio, though obviously a much darker and grittier version than the story itself, or at least the version you would tell to children, I would say. But I'm bringing you guys this video right as the creator embargo is lifting. There were a few different embargoes for this, so you might have seen some reviews for it already, from media outlets in particular, but I personally got a review copy of this on September 11th, and I've been playing it pretty much since then, so I'm not quite done with it, which means you'll wind up seeing the review after 100% for this just in a few days. But while this is a first impressions video, I'm almost done with my second playthrough of the game already, so I've already got a fair few thoughts. For starters though, let's talk a little bit about the story. I would say it's better than I was expecting it to be, honestly, because the premise itself is a little strange, with again the sort of gritty version of Pinocchio here. However, we awaken on a train after hearing an ethereal voice calling us to help them, and we awaken to find the island of Krat under siege by both puppets and a plague. Krat here is known for a substance known as ergo, which allowed them to perform technological marvels such as bringing puppets to life to perform various services. Relatively recently, there was an event called the Puppet Frenzy, in which all the puppets went crazy and started killing everyone, and while that was obviously terrible, it actually only made an already bad situation worse, because prior to that, the island was suffering from a plague known as the petrification disease that was already ravaging through the populace. The survivors have all banded together in a place called Hotel Krat, which serves as our hub area that we will work out of while we try to put a stop to both of these issues, which is going to put us into contact with some, I would say, classic Souls-like bosses. However, what makes the story particularly interesting is that, as the name of the game would imply, our puppet here is capable of lying, which is rare. Puppets aren't supposed to be able to do that. And as you play through the game, you'll be presented with opportunities to do so and choose to act more human or stay true to the rules puppets are supposed to follow, and the game will remember these choices, react to them, and how the game plays out in terms of its ending is based on this. There's actually 3 endings. But to sum that up a little more succinctly, they put a lot of effort into the story, and it shows. It was much better than I was anticipating it being, and the way they worked some of those choices into the plot is pretty cool. You also know what is going on the entire time. They're pretty good about explaining things to you, as well as foreshadowing events through notes and things like that you can find. So overall, I enjoyed the story quite a bit thus far, and we'll see how the other endings pan out. Moving right along though, as this is a Souls-like, the crux of it comes down to us killing enemies in brutal combat, getting a resource known as ergo from defeating them, which is what we're going to use to level up as well as buy things, etc. When we level up, we have the option of raising one of 6 stats, each of them raising secondary stats accordingly. However, they are affected by diminishing returns. Once you get a stat up to about 30, it starts to hit these, and by the time you get a stat up to 50, it is incredibly reduced in terms of its effectiveness when you raise it to the next level. As I would say is the usual, things like health, stamina, and carry capacity are important for everyone, and then the other 3 stats are down to damage scaling, as we will be picking up all sorts of weapons, etc. that scale off of different attributes, and you want to raise the one you are using the most and gives you the most damage off of your weapon. But the other part of progression is, of course, our equipment. We can equip a few different things, and I would say don't neglect this by any means, especially the ones that give you resistances to certain elements or damage types in certain areas. As my first playthrough, there were several bosses that were made much easier by equipping things that helped me overcome whatever status ailment they might be putting on me, etc. So equipment naturally plays a very big role. However, the 2 systems I want to talk about the most for first impressions are the weapon assembly and the Legion arm. Each weapon you find is technically made up of 2 parts, the handle and the blade. When you upgrade a weapon, which you can do with certain special upgrade items you'll find, you're upgrading the blade. The handles can be swapped out and applied to different blades to affect how they swing and handle. However, this also affects the stat that they scale off of. That's determined by the handle, and finding another item in the game, these cranks, will allow you to change and alter what stats your weapon scales off of, which is a nice way of customizing exactly the weapon you want, the way it handles, and choosing what stat it scales off of and thus how useful it is for you, which I thought was just a really cool idea. The other thing is the Legion arm. Our character's left arm by default is a robotic arm of sorts that can be swapped out and changed to an arm that will perform all sorts of powers for you. My favorite is actually the shield one that blows up when something hits it. But there's also others that deal all sorts of ranged damage, for instance, and they did some interesting things there. Now, in terms of the island of Krot and the exploration, I think they did a great job nailing the atmosphere, though the game itself is somewhat linear. That is to say, we move through an area, it's typically lightly explorable, and there are some things to be found, including some secrets, such as ciphers that will lead you to treasure, or finding the Trinity Sanctums, which will give you special rewards, and help you unravel a side mystery. But all in all, most of these levels are fairly contained, if you will, and then once you're done and you defeat the boss of that area, it opens up a pathway to the next area, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty straightforward in how you move and get around places, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, as I personally think they got the balance just about right. It was always pretty easy to figure out where I was supposed to be going, while at the same time giving you a little bit to explore. Everywhere we explore, basically, is going to be filled with enemies, so let's talk a little bit about combat. If you're familiar with any Souls-like, really, this won't come as a surprise, but I would say Dark Souls 1 in particular is what this game reminds me of the most. But of course, with a few features that make it a bit smoother. The biggest thing, obviously, being whatever weapon you're using and how that handles. But there's a few other things I want to talk about. For starters, guard and perfect guard. So guarding, or just blocking really, will reduce damage, but it won't completely mitigate it. And when you get hit when you are guarding regularly, you pick up what is called guard regain. That is to say, health you lost because you got hit while you were guarding, but if you hit the enemy back within the time frame, you'll get that health back. However, if you get hit again before that, you just lose it. So learning to play around with that system is really important. However, if you parry, that is to say, block at exactly the right moment, that is called a perfect guard, and it doesn't cost you any health at all, and is unlikely to send you reeling, which makes you much more set up for a counterattack. The perfect guard is an incredibly important mechanic. You will struggle with this game if you do not master it. However, attacking an enemy or potentially just healing, taking damage, etc. will fill up your Fable meter. These are the slots under your health bar, and these are what are going to allow you to perform your weapon's special ability. The blade of your weapon, or basically the part that's not the handle, be that a mace or whatever, is going to also give you certain special abilities. The handle gives you one too, but it's usually less impactful. These special attacks, based on the weapon you're using, can be activated when you have the appropriate amount of Fable, and these special abilities make combat a little bit more interesting as they tend to be very high-powered, so charging them up and using them at an opportune moment can turn the tide of battle in your favor, especially since those attacks tend to stagger enemies much more effectively. If you hit an enemy or guard enough of their attacks, they will take weapon durability damage. It's possible to break their weapons this way, which severely reduces the damage they can do, but it can also potentially stagger them, which is when the outline of their health bar starts to glow white, and if you hit them with a heavy attack at this point, they will fall down and be ripe for a fatal attack. That is to say, a big wide open attack where they are down, and it deals a ton of damage, which is very good to know for certain bosses. There's more to it, of course, things like consumables, grindstones, which can add elemental damage types to your weapon, etc. For the first impressions video, I'll leave it kind of right there. However, the challenge of combat is stringing all of that together effectively so you can dominate your enemies and bosses alike. But like any Souls-like, it is a challenging experience. It is especially brutal towards the end of the game, as many bosses have second phases and can deal an incredible amount of damage, so if you're not prepared in learning the systems, you're going to have a bad time. The last boss of the game in particular took me like 30 tries on the first go around. However, I will say that defeating that boss taught me more about the game than most of the lead up to it did. And while combat has a lot going on, there's a lot of variations, mechanics, things like that to know that I think are done very well. There are also a few parts of this that I think could use some touching up. For starters, bosses in particular, though enemies in general, tend to occasionally just spam a certain move, and I've seen bosses and even some regular enemies or just mini bosses do the same thing like 5-6 times in a row. And I'm not sure if that would be a bug or anything, but it seemed somewhat intentional, and sometimes it could be very frustrating. Another part of this is that because you are a more regular-sized person and the bosses and other puppets tend to tower over you, it's fairly common, even when you're guarding perfectly against an enemy, for them to push you into a corner that you suddenly can't move out of because you can't just walk through the enemy. And that enemy is so large that it effectively blocks the camera in that corner, and then you wind up dying because you can't see and you can't move. And again, that can happen even if you're doing the right thing. You just kind of get pushed into a corner by these large attacks, even if you guard them perfectly, etc. So I think there's some room for adjustments there to make that happen less. And the last thing I want to mention is a little more specific, in that almost every major boss of this game has a second phase with a full second health bar, and it gets a little over the top towards the end of the game. The first few bosses aren't like this, but pretty much everything after the third boss, in terms of the major ones that end each section or level, has a second phase. And while that's a fine enough mechanic on its own in certain situations, to do it for literally almost every boss definitely wore on my patience by the end of my first run through. Especially because it's not really a surprise at that point anymore. I'm burning through the first boss's health bar quick with the appropriate damage buffs, modifiers, and I'm thinking to myself every time I fight one of these bosses, there's going to be a second phase. There was like one late in the game that didn't, which was a bit of a surprise, honestly. But even though the bosses are all different, have their own movesets, etc., they all kind of feel a little too similar as a result of that, because your strategy doesn't really change at that point. It's basically just buff yourself with whatever element that boss happens to be weak to, burn down the first phase, or play a little more conservatively to save your healing items maybe, and then deal with the more high damage second phase, which usually has some extra attacks or two, which makes the bosses feel a little less unique after a while, or at least it did for me. That said, some of them are brutally challenging, so that may or may not be a good thing for some people. In order to mitigate that a little bit, however, most bosses have a Spectre available to help you. Outside the boss arena, you can use an item to summon a Spectre in the fight, which can help you if you're having trouble, though how useful they are will certainly vary. But to kind of wrap this up and save the rest of it for the review, I would say Lies of P impressed me quite a bit. It was substantially more than I was expecting it to be. I'm still playing it, I'm still enjoying it. The story and choices are a lot more interesting than I was expecting. The combat is really good and engaging. The world and environments are, I would say, perfect. They're almost whimsical, yet somehow really sinister at the same time, which I think for this kind of game is exactly what you want. So in a lot of ways, I think Lies of P does a fantastic job at what it's trying to do, to a point where even though it's obviously a Souls-like, it still manages to feel unique at the same time, which is the part that impresses me the most. So for first impressions, they are very positive. We will see how the other endings and things play out. Hopefully, I'll have that review done this weekend. Like I said, I'm not really that far off from being done with it. But for now, it's safe to say I'm enjoying the game quite a bit. That is going to do it for me today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.